That's So Hindu listeners. Devala Rees is back with us this week for another informative, enlightening, and hopefully entertaining discussion. This week we're talking about how ancient Indian society organized itself, with the subtitle of, quote, hint, it wasn't caste, the different social groups that were traditionally used, and how these morphed into something else entirely once British administrators in the 19th century decided they wanted to try to understand the people they ruled in India, and how this has implications today, both in India and the diaspora. Okay, so today we're going to talk about how ancient Indian society was organized, with the subtext of it not being caste, the word caste, specifically. So, if you take today's anti-caste activists and the scholar activists of the world at their word, you could be forgiven for thinking that all of India, since time immemorial, was organized into this rigid hierarchical pyramid caste pyramid scheme, with priests on the top enforcing everyone below them into their birth-based subservient roles, etc., etc. Many listeners of That's So Hindu probably are very familiar with this narrative because it's the one that's out there and we see it every week. And I once described pushing back on this in a recent HAF internal meeting, to share perhaps too much, as being like Sisyphus pushing a big spiked rock up a hill, which rolls down against you all the time because it's that entrenched. But the reality, which we've tried to get into at HAF many times, is that the history of India and how its social organization was and is far more complex than that, to the point of what anti-caste activists and scholar activists tell you being almost a caricature and an irrelevant one at that. So with that, inform us. What do we have wrong? What do they have wrong? What do the textbooks have wrong? And take that wherever you want. Jump in.
All right. What they have wrong is honestly pretty much everything. My response to that may go further than even a lot of proud Hindus might think, if they haven't significantly researched ancient Indian history from unbiased sources. I'm not just going to say that that's not the whole picture, or that that's like, a stereotype with some truth to it, but it leaves out some nuances. That was pretty close to never true in Indian history prior to 1862. And indeed, never prior to 1862 was there any category that can be accurately and consistently translated as caste in any Indian society. This category of caste was a European notion that there's no Indian word or concept that you can translate caste as, where it would hold even close to consistent across time or across regions in India. It blurs all sorts of stuff together and dramatically misunderstands what was actually going on. Now, I'm not denying that in India, in Indian history, sometimes there were groups of people who were ostracized and discriminated against. That absolutely happened, similarly to how it happened in every other society on Earth beyond the hunter-gatherer stage, but not in any pervasively unique way in India. So what actually happened here was, to kind of draw, I guess, from ancient India, the way that social organization actually worked. So there were many different people groups, tribes, tribal confederations, and nations in ancient India. Each of them did things their own ways. So there's very little that you can accurately generalize across all of them. But there were common features that we can talk about across many of them, or most of them, or at least most of the large ones. So individuals were part of families. Families were part of clans, usually called kulas in Sanskrit. I'm going to use the Sanskrit terms here because Sanskrit was by far the most widespread language in ancient India. But of course, there were hundreds and hundreds of different languages, and each of them would have had their own terms for this, but the most widespread was Sanskrit, so I'm going to use Sanskrit terms for that reason here. There were clans, kulas, which are extended families through blood and through marriage. Many of these families and clans, if they shared some distinguishing social features in common with each other, they might form a jati. A jati is not a caste. A jati is a tribe. Jati pretty much 100% maps to the English concept of tribe. Much better than some unique category of caste that's unique to India. It means a tribe, the same way that tribes work everywhere. That they have shared origin stories for their tribe, histories, worldviews, certain teachings, certain customs. They have the features of a tribe, such as it's possible to be excommunicated from it, not in a religious sense, but in a tribal sense. They have certain trades, guild affiliations, occupations, not necessarily all of these things for any given jati, but these are the sorts of things that might define any given jati. It's not like jatis were written down in some scripture with a list of them, ever, literally ever, in the whole history of India. Jatis were grassroots. They grew from the ground up as different clans came together because they had common interests and they collaborated. They would tend to have internal variation also because multiple clans would compose a tribe and each one would maintain some of their own traditions while also homogenizing with the rest of the tribe to some degree. Then kind of another tier higher up from that, many different kulas and jatis, tribes and clans, through marriages or through treaties, might form a jana or a confederation. Usually then they would have a council that would lead the jana, which would be, the council would be the leaders of each of the clans from within the jana, and they would usually elect one leader in common. And the territory of a jana would be called a janapada. There were 64 of these across ancient India. We can give a specific number. Specifically 64, the time period during which historians can lock down that there were 64 is we're talking about 1100 BCE. By that time, we can solidly say there were 64 of these across ancient India. Separately from that, there were also three great Tamil dynasties, the Cheras, the Cholas, and the Pandyas. So sort of 67. The Tamils did things a little differently from the others. These mostly were formed around cities. They were like city-states for the most part. There were thousands of other smaller settlements at the same time outside of these big 67, which were tribal ones, jatis, that didn't join confederations, but remained tribes living in the forest or in rural areas. From these 67 large groups, some of them further grouped together through marriage or through treaties, formed Mahajanapadas, or just big Janapadas. There was 16 of these classically. And these are kind of like nations, we might say, recognizable to the way, or similar at least to the way that modern nation states work. This wasn't a top-down, there was no top-down structure standardized across these, literally ever, period. That's just a factually true sentence that doesn't even need qualification. There was never any caste system standardized across the Mahajanapadas or across the Janapadas. Some kingdoms, at some points in history, following certain dharma traditions, instituted more endogenously locked systems that interpreted. So let me backtrack a little bit. The stereotype of the caste system often speaks in terms of Vedic varnas, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras. I think everyone watching this is probably familiar with those four categories, and would often add a fifth category of avarnas or untouchables. so to speak. That's kind of the stereotypical caste system. Many of the Janapadas and Mahajanapadas throughout the history of India never had literally anything like that at all, period. Even if they were very much Hindu. There were many different Hindu Dharma traditions. Most of them never taught anything like that. Some of them, so of the ones that followed the Vedas, which is not all of them, a subset, there were 6 orthodox philosophical schools derived from the Vedas, plus a bunch of other philosophical schools that were derived from other sources or other lines of thought. Of the 6, one of them was called Mimamsa. Some of the kingdoms following Mimamsa philosophy, or Karma Mimamsa philosophy, to be more precise, because there is another school also called Mimamsa, but the Karma Mimamsakas, some of them interpreted the category of Vedic Varnas in a way different from everybody else. They interpreted them as, in most cases, hereditary, and they used them as a more rigid system of social stratification. People will take sources from these very, very limited subset of ancient Indian kingdoms as the model of, quote unquote, the Hindu caste system. The way that started happening was that when the British came in and started studying Hindu sources, they looked for something resembling legal codes that they could easily pick up and use, that were familiar to them, that most closely resembled Victorian era British law. And they came upon particularly the Manava Dharma Shastra, or what in more recent times became more popularly called the Manusmriti, which it did look like this. That was a source that grew out of one of these Karma Mimamsaka traditions that organized society in that way because it was very economically efficient and tended to give a lot of power to the administrators. And so it was useful. Never mind the fact that there were other Dharma Shastras out there that other kingdoms used that had totally different models. There were many kingdoms out there that didn't use any Mimamsaka Dharma Shastras, but had been, even from a Hindu standpoint, vociferously criticizing these systems throughout history. And that's well recorded. That all gets completely ignored in the mainstream narrative that the British picked up. Prior to 1862, at no time in the entire history of India did most Indians follow anything like the administration of the Manusmriti, or anything like a standardized pan-Indian caste system. Nor was it tied to Hindu religion. That was all, truly all of that was instituted by the British. Before that, it was totally widely varied by region. There were some regions where something like that had happened at certain points in history, but never anything close to all or even most Hindus. The British picked this up and used the Manusmriti as a source and interpreted it. They even stretched the Manusmriti itself because they interpreted it through a very Protestant lens. They kind of brought their view of religion, so they were overwhelmingly Protestant Christians. Protestants are used to an anti-Catholic narrative, where they look at there is a entrenched priestly orthodoxy that is corrupt and self-serving, of priests who bend religious teachings toward their own power in a way that is fundamentally corrupt and selfish. This is the Protestant stereotype of Catholicism. The British brought this to the way that they viewed Brahmins and Hindu priests, and the way that Hindu priests, in their view, used Hinduism to control Hindu people. They weren't learning this from an impartial study of social realities in India. They were learning this from the way that Protestants think about religion in a European context, in a Christian context, and applying that lens to their interpretations of Indian religion and to their enforcement of law in India. So the British had a tool of colonial legal rule which I don't necessarily object to in principle, which is their policy was to try to rule over colonized peoples using those people's own native laws as much as was not incompatible with British interests. It's arguable whether the British did this because they had good intentions or whether they thought that that would lead to the least amount of unrest. But either way, that was the approach they took. So they applied Sharia law to they used Sharia as the civil law of Muslims in their colonies. And looking for something to use for Hindus, they were looking for a text. They ended up picking up the Manusmriti as their main basis. Never mind the fact that most Hindus had never heard of it. Most of their ancestors had never lived by it. The British picked up that one and used it in their own particular interpretation. The degree to which this was something that the British imposed on most Indians as of 1862 becomes really apparent when you look at the early attempts that the British made of taking a census in India, because they did a caste census, because since they were going to administrate people based on their caste, they needed to give everyone a caste in their own legal records. Nothing like that existed in current Indian records. So the British sent out census officers to ask every Indian, "What is your caste?" If you look at those early records, if you cut several decades later, Indians had now learned what the British meant by that, and everyone knew their caste. But when the British started doing that, most Indians had no idea what they were being asked. Some people would say woman, like, "I'm a woman. Is that what you're asking?" Like, they would say, "I'm a potter." They would say, "I live near X river." Some of them gave the names of important trees that grew nearby their home. They had no idea what the British were asking for. There was no category like this in the way that they thought of themselves or the way that their societies worked in most cases. Also, at the time before 1862, most Indians didn't have a surname. They had a personal name, and that was it. There was no family last name that was hereditary, which the British made a critical part of how caste got institutionalized. So when they imposed surnames, people would give their job, their region. Some would say the name of their parent, and that would suddenly got frozen as a snapshot of exactly how everything was in 1862. And now those persons' descendants to this day have that surname, but it was just whoever that person's parent was when they got asked the question in 1862. It's a very weird snapshot of history that got institutionalized into a rigid identity that wasn't rigid before that point. Then that all got so deeply entrenched because it got put on everybody's taxation records. It got put on everybody's police files. It got put on every child's school enrollment. It got put on everybody's land records, on your land deeds for the property that you own. It got put on everybody's ration cards for the way that people were given food in a lot of British-run villages and so on. It got administratively frozen into the way modern Indian society was built under the British, and modern India, even post-independence, 100% inherited that. Does India have a caste system now? Objectively, yes. It very much legally has a caste system now, but it's a matter of objective fact that it never did before 1862. I could go on with this, but I'll
no. Let me jump in here because
go ahead.
The thing, as I was going to say closet history nerd, but no, I'm not in the closet on that love of history.
Oh yeah,
this is fascinating to me, and I find it very useful. And in terms of the census documents that were referenced, for those people that want to go look at them, they are available online, and I have read them. And I can concur that people will answer all sorts of things. People will say, "I'm a fisherman, I'm whatever." And also, it's not crazy in a historical sense that people would start taking on the last names when they were imposed upon them of familial occupations. That is the nature of so many names, or parents, so many names in the British Isles themselves. It's like,
yeah, exactly. In the British Isles, a similar thing happened when, if there's if there's 3 people in the village named John,
yeah, one of them's going to be John Cooper, and he's the guy that made barrels. Exactly. And now forever, Karen Cooper, years and centuries later, doesn't realize their family were barrel makers because they moved on.
Yeah, but everyone gets locked to a certain snapshot in time whenever that system was first implemented, and it kind of gives an impression of a hereditary social rigidity, but that was actually just kind of, in many cases, arbitrarily determined by the moment in time when the snapshot was taken.
Right.
Yeah.
2 things. Let's do this one first.
Yeah.
So then to spawn the history nerd comment this is historically fascinating. And then what difference does this make today? I'll be blunt about it. To somebody whose family was from an economically disenfranchised, disadvantaged job, some unclean job, literally unclean, like they, worked with dead animals, clean sewers, whatever. And that somehow is what their family got locked into for myriad reasons.
Yeah.
What difference does it make to them, this history today?
What difference it makes to them? Their legal and political situation, if they still live in India, is very different today. India, upon independence from the British, built its own new caste system of caste-based reservations and so on to try, essentially as a affirmative action strategy, to try to correct for a lot of the iniquities that had been built into Indian society under the British Raj. The biggest point of difference this makes to them today is to understand that this was not part of their cultural or religious heritage prior to colonial interference in the same way, such that those people, if they feel any inclination toward Hindu Dharma traditions, they should know that those traditions do not in any way mandate or inherently advocate for their oppression, which many people have told them explicitly that they do.
Yeah, and they seem to have imbibed that into every fiber of their activism, if we're talking about today, contemporary.
Some of them have. I would actually somewhat challenge that. I mean, certainly there are activists who absolutely have imbibed that into every fiber of their activism. But if you look at Pew polling in India for what religion, other backward classes, and scheduled classes, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, etc., the people who are colloquially referred to as Dalits, identify with, it's overwhelmingly Hinduism. In fact, often at comparable or sometimes higher percentages than upper castes. There's this kind of a stereotype that with the post-independence movement and the popularity of figures like Ambedkar and others, that there was a mass exodus of Dalits from Hinduism. The stats don't bear that out. Certainly, did millions of them leave? Yes. And in certain regions, almost entire communities did wholesale. For instance, in Maharashtra, that happened a lot. But this is cherry picking from the fringe. The vast bulk of the many millions of them remain very passionately practitioners of Hindu Dharma traditions, who not only say that they are Hindu, but say that their spiritual traditions are very important in their lives. And they also say that there is not a lot of discrimination against them. A sizable majority of them in India today report that. So I think that even the perception of how big the conflict is gets misreported to sort of boost the loud voices and ignore the masses who are perfectly happy and quietly living their lives and practicing their spiritual traditions all over India still.
Mm-hmm. So there's more sound than there, or more fury than there's sound fury. Rahm Emanuel has this great thing that total tangent, and it's a great way of saying it. I heard this interview with him recently, who may be running for president, and that's why he's doing these interviews. He says you have to distinguish between sound and fury, and it sounds like you're saying that there is more sound than there is actual fury.
Yes, indeed. Which is not to discount that there is some fury, and when it comes to the fury, what I would say is anybody in India or elsewhere who's getting discriminated against because of the community of their birth, if they're being treated with disrespect in social situations, if they're being ostracized at work, if they're being barred from certain pursuing certain careers or forced into unpleasant lines of work, I 100% sympathize with their fury, and I think that they are right to be furious. I think that they're often furious, in the cases of the ones who are furious, they're often furious at the wrong people. And this is important not only for the sake of defending Hindu Dharma traditions against false allegations of bigotry, but it's also important for the actual aggrieved people because they're barking up the wrong tree when it comes to solving their problems. These Hindu Dharma traditions, which they often malign following the British colonial and missionary propaganda, which told them to malign them, could be some of their greatest allies in equality. For thousands of years, Vaishnava, Shaiva, Shakta, and various other Hindu gurus have been among the greatest advocates for social equality in India, for building communities, strong and supportive communities that didn't discriminate on anybody based on birth, who were the loudest voices of protest against certain kingdoms implementing certain Mimamsaka specific legal codes that were discriminatory and so on. To lump all of Hinduism together as a monolith like that and blame it for the problem is not only inaccurate, but it's also failing to recognize, both historically and in contemporary times, a huge number of very powerful allies among Hindu traditions, specifically for egalitarianism and against that sort of oppression. So I think that I totally sympathize and agree with people's fury. I think that if those of them who follow the trap of directing their fury along the lines of colonial propaganda not only are being unfair to others, but they're not doing themselves any favors either in terms of effectively directing their efforts to where it will actually yield lasting and structural improvement.
Okay. Let's back up to some terminology here.
Sure.
You mentioned... Yeah, no, I mean, we went through all. I'm not going to go into kingdoms and let's keep it in contemporary times and how some of this has evolved over the past several millennia. You mentioned jati and you mentioned varna, the two terms that, if we have to pick two, that are most associated with the word caste. Let's take it as written. People can go and listen to other things that I have done for HAF and 2 podcasts on the categories that make up caste. Those two are the predominant ones. How then does Varna get tied to Jati? And can we say anything about that as one unit succinctly? And what do you think about, I just reviewed this film, it'll be forthcoming, it's out in India, it'll be out in the US soon, where they talk about non-Brahmins being priests. To me, if we're talking about Varna, you're a Brahmin if you're performing priestly duties, regardless of what your family used to do.
Yeah.
So unpack those for me. Correct my errors.
Sure. Okay. So Varna originally were descriptions by Vedic age people as sectors of society. This was originally descriptive rather than prescriptive. It was as any society that is not at a hunter-gatherer level. If you have villages that are bigger than in the range of 50 to maybe 200 people, you're going to start having a division of labor. You're going to have people specializing in trade. You're going to have warriors. You're going to have administrators. You're going to have scholars. You're going to have laborers of various types. You're going to have categories resembling the Vedic Varnas. That's just descriptive of every human society in history. That's beyond a hunter-gatherer level.
I mean, and every society, if you don't have to do everything, everyone has inclinations towards certain types of work.
Yeah. And not only certain types of work, but you could use analogous categories to those four to describe any human society in all of history that is beyond hunter-gatherer level. Mm-hmm. I would argue it's not just like an arbitrary or a prescriptive set of four. That's just descriptive of the way the human societies work. It's not necessarily the only way you could describe it, but it's a pretty obvious and widely applicable way you can describe it. Some sources in Indian history, not all, specifically in the Mimamsaka tradition, and I don't mean to even get too universally critical of Karma Mimamsakas. This wasn't even even among them. There was always significant avenue for social mobility. These things were never completely hereditarily locked, even among Mimamsaka societies, but not at all among non-Mimamsaka societies. So Jati originally had nothing to do with Varna. Jatis were just tribes that grew from the ground up. As I mentioned, they were tribes that formed the way tribes form anywhere in the world. Only among Mimamsakas was there ever an attempt to match up Jatis with Varnas. And this was always inconsistent. They wouldn't be you wouldn't have the same Jatis in two different regions of India ever at any point in Indian history, including today. And you wouldn't, even if you did have the same Jatis, you might not assign them to the same Varnas, because never was this standardized, never was it top down. This is how societies grew organically, bottom up, and these were certain groups of people's attempts to describe them, and in certain legal codes followed in certain kingdoms to administrate them. In the modern sense, so you're talking about like non-Brahmin priests. So sure, in the ancient traditional sense, if you're a priest, then you're a Brahmin. That's certainly how it would be used in a Vedic sense. When the British instituted the first actual objective caste system in the history of India in 1862, they created a legal definition of Brahmin, which had never before existed in that way. And so in India now, if you say Brahmin, you might have to specify, are you talking about Brahmin in terms of the Vedic philosophical category, or are you talking about Brahmin, the legal category in Indian law? In the latter sense, you can absolutely have non-Brahmin priests, because it's no longer tied to what you do, it's tied to your family. So absolutely, there are priests who are not Brahmins in the modern Indian legal sense from 1862 on. And that's fine. That has always been how that works. There have always been, throughout the entire history of India, throughout many Hindu Dharma traditions and non-Hindu Dharma traditions, there have been many officiants or priests, people in temples who come from backgrounds of all jatis, who come, if you take Varna in a hereditary sense, there have always been priests of all Varnas, because every community had their own spiritual traditions, their own ceremonies, their own officiants. And they still do. That's how it works on the ground in India. Indeed, I would venture to say it is very likely true that always, at all times in Indian history, from ancient times and still today in India, a large majority of people officiating in priestly functions were not of Brahmin pedigree in some hereditary sense. That's taking very specific Hindu Dharma traditions of karma mimamsa, and it's quite inaccurate to try to apply that to all Hindu communities. That's never been on the ground.
Okay, we have a few minutes left, literally a few. Is there anything in this that you want to? I feel like we've gone over a whole bunch. We've brain dumped on people here. Is there anything you want people to take away from this on the category of how was ancient Indian society organized and not caste, and bringing it up today? If there's one thing to close this out with.
Ancient India wasn't one society. It was about 4,400 distinct societies. Each one was organized differently. There was never a standardized top-down system. And on the ground, in Indian villages, among Indian communities, that's still how it is, more than not. If you try to answer that question with any one method of organization, you're going to be wildly wrong about a very large percentage of Indians at any time in history that you're talking about. It was always very heterogeneous. And there was never anything other than what the British attempted to, prior to 1862, there was never anything even close to homogeneous enforced across India in terms of social organization.
Well, that's it for this episode of That's So Hindu. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it now with someone who you think will like it too. Please also like, follow, and/or subscribe to this show on whatever platform you're listening to it on. You can help ensure that more of these get made by making a donation to HAF at www.hinduamerican.org/donate. Thanks again for listening.